I don't understand how people can just see all the problems kids are having today and not think that this is not normal.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada-Gore, and today our guest is Stephanie Seneff. Stephanie is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has a bachelor's degree from MIT in biology with a minor in food and nutrition, and a PhD from MIT in computer science. A health crisis in her own family precipitated her interest in nutrition, and she has found that dietary deficiencies and environmental toxins can explain many modern diseases and conditions. Before diving into today's conversation, we want to pause and thank our sponsors. Free and Healthy Children International, offering a safe alternative to vaccination. Visit freeandhealthychildren.org. And The Adventures of Andrew Price, a new children's book that follows Dr. Weston A. Price's footsteps. Go to adventuresofandrewprice.com. Now listen in on this compelling conversation recorded at the Wise Traditions Conference in Anaheim last fall. Stephanie, welcome. I'm glad you're here today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, you are a research scientist at MIT. How did you get into this whole realm of heart disease and cholesterol?
Yes, it's a story that you might imagine is true for many people, which is that I was touched personally. My husband was we were very surprised. He was diagnosed with heart disease very suddenly and put very quickly under the probe to find that he had a blocked artery. He got a stent inserted. It was a complete shock to us. We thought he was fine before that, and all of a sudden he had this problem. They put him on a high-dose statin, 4 times the normal dosage. The doctor said he had to take that high-dose statin for the rest of his life. And of course, he immediately started getting nasty symptoms. We didn't know much about heart disease at that point. This was 8 years ago. I got very interested in both heart disease and statin drugs. Having a degree in biology from MIT, an undergraduate degree, I was equipped to go ahead and read the research literature. Very interested in finding out exactly what do statins do, how does it affect the body, exactly what is heart disease, how are they explaining it. And the more I dug, the more I realized that they didn't understand what heart disease was, and that the statin drugs were not the appropriate treatment.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you had a personal, passionate interest in it, and you found that a lot of what you were reading wasn't correct. What were some of the mistakes that you were finding?
Well, what I was reading was correct. I was digging into the research literature, some of it from quite far back, actually, 1960s, if you can imagine. And I was finding that back then they recognized that heart disease was linked to sulfur deficiency. There were experiments that were done in the 60s, for example, on monkeys. And they found, and they knew that if you fed these monkeys a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet, you could induce something that looked like heart disease. But if you also fed them sulfur-containing amino acids, they didn't get heart disease. So that gave me a huge hint that maybe sulfur had something to do with it.
Interesting. Now, what foods contain sulfur?
Well, of course, seafood is a very good choice, and also eggs. Eggs, both the whites and the yolks, contain sulfur. Eggs are extremely healthy for you, especially, of course, it has to be organic, healthy chickens, you know.
Uh-huh.
And in terms of vegetables, it's the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and then also onions and garlic. Garlic is a great one, and we eat lots of garlic in my family.
Oh, it makes
Garlic's
me so
a
happy that
terrific
garlic and
source.
onion is on that list.
I love garlic and onion, and so we use it a lot in our cooking.
But my question is, if this research had been done and was correct, as you said, how did it get buried or lost?
I think in the 70s when they figured out they had this drug that could make cholesterol go down, I think they saw dollar signs in their eyes, and they thought if we can just convince people that cholesterol is the problem, we've got gold. I mean, cynically speaking, that's what I believe.
Wow.
And the literature on the sulfur connection pretty much shut down at that point. And even they had done studies in the 60s on humans, and they showed that people who had heart disease and the particular arteries that where the heart disease was, where the cholesterol was building up, those particular arteries were producing lots of sulfate in the artery wall in those people compared to the other arteries everywhere else in the body and compared to younger people. So in other words, when the artery is diseased in the sense that it's got cholesterol and fat buildup in it, it's producing lots of sulfate. And that is critical. That is absolutely critical because the diseased region of the artery is producing a product that the heart desperately needs.
Okay, so back to your husband, because I'm interested in this story. When you were discovering this information, what did you do? Did you take him off statins and then start applying him with these cruciferous vegetables?
Well, this is exactly right. And in fact, of course, we had a battle with his doctor. And I was furiously studying. I printed out all these papers. I took them with me. We went to the doctor's office, and I had them ready to show him, all these papers showing all the damage that statin drugs do. Because there's a lot of stuff on statin damage. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of literature on that. A lot of it's in the more obscure journals. It's not in the mainstream, but it's there, and it's very clear. And I wanted my husband off the statin. And the doctor, of course, said if he takes any less, he said right out in that meeting, if he takes any less than 4 times the normal dosage, I will no longer be his doctor. He gave us, he really played hardball.
An ultimatum.
Yeah, and I said, would you like to see these doctors? He said, that won't be necessary. That won't be necessary. He already knew statins are perfect. They're going to solve your husband's problem. Just forget about it. Take the statin and don't argue with me.
So, of course, you were already convinced from what you had read, so I imagine he stopped being your husband's doctor?
We fired him, so he did stop, but not on his choice, on our choice. We got a new doctor. The new doctor, of course, was also handing out statins like candy, but he said, if you're not going to take it, that's okay with me. I'm not going to force you. And so my husband got off the statin. He's been statin-free for 7 years. He's doing fantastically well. He's on a high cholesterol, high fat, high sulfur diet.
Hold on. Those words are enough to give some people a heart attack.
I know.
High cholesterol.
High cholesterol.
High fat.
Yes.
And yet he's doing great.
He's doing great. In fact, every time he goes to the doctor's amazed at how well he's doing. And he's the only one in the waiting room that isn't crippled. I mean, these people show up in wheelchairs. They've got canes. Because they're being destroyed by the statin. The statin destroys your muscles. It destroys your bones. It's really horrible. It causes huge numbers of side effects related to getting older. Cataracts, diabetes, hair loss, arthritis, all these problems related to aging. And in fact, a wonderful paper that I just found just came out recently, explained how statins make you grow older faster. And that's exactly what the phrase they used. I'd been using that phrase for quite some time, statins make you grow older faster, because I saw all these conditions that are related to growing old that statins were causing. They said the reason was because, and they showed it in the paper, that they disrupt the ability of stem cells to evolve into functioning cells. It's really, really important because the stem cells come in from the bone marrow and they replace cells that are worn out, even in your heart. So your heart can't renew itself because of the statin drug. So they actually cause heart failure.
But somehow, again, this information is not in the mainstream.
No, I mean, it's crazy. They keep on saying more and more people need to be on these statin drugs. They're handing them out to everybody, even children, which is really shocking because children desperately need the cholesterol for their development, for their brain. It's amazing to me that they don't think that's a problem. To just give a child a statin drug is just a horrendous idea, in my opinion.
A friend of mine from when we were in our 30s was on statins because he said his family had a history of heart disease. Mm-hmm. So here he is in his 30s on the statins. And even back then, I didn't know much about food, but I remember raising some eyebrows at that. He is still on them today, and he seems much older. Like, he's forgetful.
Right.
He's like, I don't know what I'm thinking, and I'm like, how is this happening? But it could be the statins.
Right, and every individual only grows old once. They don't know how the aging process is supposed to play out. They're getting old fast, and they're thinking, well, I'm just getting old, right? That's very logical. They don't think it's a statin drug that's causing it. It's very insidious. It's horrible. And I go to the airport. I mean, I was at the airport, of course, and there were all these wheelchairs. As I was getting on board, there were like 3 or 4 wheelchairs in the group, people in wheelchairs waiting to get on. I mean, it's just, I see more and more wheelchairs. And of course, you come off the flight, there's a big line of wheelchairs waiting for people to get off. People are getting crippled on this stuff,
Interesting that you say that. I noticed the same thing on my flight on the way here, and I thought, this is more than usual.
It's not normal. All these wheelchairs. I bet you just looked at how many wheelchairs the airports are buying over time. You would find a tremendous increase in step with increased use of statin drugs, I bet.
So you were saying that from what you studied, sulfur is beneficial for the heart. What's going on with the general population? Should we be taking things preventively or eating different things? Talk to me about our deficiencies as a nation.
I think that the really key underlying problem to the sulfur deficiency in this country is the food, and in fact it's the toxic chemicals in the food, and in particular it's one toxic chemical in the food, which is glyphosate. the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide Roundup.
Glyphosate.
Glyphosate.
I've heard of that.
Yes, it's the active ingredient. Roundup is an herbicide. It kills all plants except for those that have been genetically engineered through a bacterial gene insertion to be resistant.
So people can go to a hardware store and buy some Roundup weed killer, and they think, oh, I'm just going to get rid of weeds in my garden.
Yes.
But on an industrial agricultural level, they are using it on a massive scale. Is that
Exactly.
right?
They're using it on a massive and increasing scale. And it has been an incredible increase in the amount of Roundup that's been put on our core crops since 1995, 1996, when they first introduced. This was a wonderful solution. You have the corn, the soy, the canola, the sugar beets. These are all the core crops of the processed food industry. You know, the candy bars and the protein bars and all the drinks, the Coca-Cola, all those things come out of these crops. And they claimed that it would allow them to use less herbicide, but in fact it did the exact opposite. And every year that these Roundup-ready crops were grown, they needed more. They needed more glyphosate to kill the weeds because the weeds got resistant. The weeds adopted resistance in the presence of the resistant crops.
But can't we just wash off our corn and, get the pesticide off that way?
No, it's been soaked up into the actual food, so you can't wash it off. It's inside the food.
Okay, so there's this glyphosate in our food stream, whether we're drinking it or eating it, ingesting it, unbeknownst to ourselves, right? Because we don't know that it's in a lot of these crops.
No, we're not completely unaware of it, and most of us are. Most of us have never heard of glyphosate. I hadn't heard of glyphosate, actually, until just a few years ago. So it wasn't what I figured out initially with respect to my husband. Now we're on a very strict organic diet. This has been another increasingly important, it's a critical piece of the puzzle. And he got even better once we went on the organic diet. He started cutting back on his diabetes medication. His blood pressure is better. He's very, very healthy on the organic diet. So now we buy everything organic at Whole Foods or at the farmer's market. We even ask, is it organic? And if it isn't, we won't buy it for our own eating at home.
And that's a way to avoid this glyphosate,
Yes.
which is affecting our sulfur levels.
Yeah, so glyphosate is actually an incredibly interesting molecule, and I'm absolutely fascinated by it. It gives you a real window into human physiology because it's such a train wreck. It really messes up so much of your metabolism. It's really, really amazing. And a crucial thing that it messes up is sulfate. It messes up your body's ability to synthesize sulfate. It messes up your body's ability to transport sulfate, and it increases your body's exporting of sulfate through the urine. It causes you to lose sulfate through the urine.
And we need the sulfate to protect our hearts,
That's
for one
right.
thing.
That's
I imagine
right.
we don't understand our bodies completely, but I imagine it has other functions as well.
It has huge functions. Sulfate is absolutely essential in the brain for the neurotransmission. In fact, Alzheimer's patients have low levels of a particular sulfate-modified fat in their brain. And autistic kids have very low levels of sulfate in their cerebrospinal fluid. So I think the sulfate deficiency is also linked very definitely to autism and to Alzheimer's disease, as well as to heart disease.
Wow, fascinating. So we have these deficiencies. On a small scale, we can try to eat strictly organic, as you're
Yes.
suggesting, and try to make choices that eating more cruciferous vegetables
Yes.
and whatnot. Is there anything we can do on a larger scale?
Well, there's another thing in terms of eating is to eat saturated fats, which is, of course, the opposite of what they recommend. Eat a lot of saturated fat. Coconut oil is very, very good. And also lard. We use lard as our oil for cooking. People typically will buy one of these seed oils like soybean oil or corn oil or safflower or sunflower oil. These are all really bad oils. In part, they're bad because of glyphosate. And glyphosate is in the soybean and the corn oil, of course, because those are GMO Roundup ready. Mm-hmm. But I was really shocked to find out that even sunflowers are sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest. The glyphosate gets soaked up into the seed, and then the seed gets turned into oil. So you're going to have oil in crops that are even not Roundup ready, which are sprayed right before the harvest in order to kill the plant and also to get a head start on next year's weeds. And they do that also for wheat and for sugarcane, and those are core crops of the processed food industry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I remember someone saying everyone thinks in the U.S. they've got, gluten sensitivities or they're gluten intolerant, and they said actually it might be the glyphosate that they spray on the wheat that people are sensitive to.
That's right, and I wrote a paper together with Anthony Samsel on exactly that topic. In fact, it was fascinating that you could just look at gluten intolerance is a very complex condition with a lot of related things that are wrong, and you can find all of those things that are linked to gluten intolerance, and then you can go to glyphosate and say, could it cause this? And you can find a plausible pathway. So you can basically explain all the features of gluten intolerance through glyphosate poisoning, including especially the one that makes them die young, which is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They have an increased risk to cancer, and particularly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has been linked to glyphosate. Glyphosate is a causal factor, along with other toxic pesticides, in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Okay, I'm going to bring up a silly analogy. Tell me if this is right. You have a hitman. You have someone killing someone else, but behind the hitman is the mafia, right?
Yes.
So it's almost like glyphosate may be at the root of more issues, health issues, than we think.
I think pretty much all of the health issues that we face today, I can find connections to glyphosate in all of them. And if you look at correlation statistics, I'm a computer scientist, and I look at a lot of number type stuff, and you can look at the increased rate of various diseases over time, and you find that Alzheimer's and autism are both going up dramatically over time. I'm very disturbed with this latest announcement. I don't know if you heard, 1 in 45 this year that just came out.
1 in 45 children?
1 out of 45. More than 2% of our kids are on the spectrum. And the government is always like, oh, well, that's not a problem. Of course, we're just reporting it more. I mean, I get so angry when I hear that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. The naysayer would be like, oh, we're just noticing it more. There were always children who were a little different. What do you say to someone who has that philosophy?
I just get very, very disturbed when I hear that, because that is such a way to just excuse the problem and not face it. I think we're probably diagnosing it less because the school systems are under a tremendous burden to pay for the extra cost for the education of these kids. Once they say you're on the autism spectrum, they're obligated to give them this special treatment that's going to be very expensive, and it's going to bankrupt the school system.
So they would rather say, you're okay.
Yeah, we're just going to let you kick you down the road because, you don't really have autism. I know you're a little weird, but, it's fine. It's just like they don't want to spend that money, I would guess. And I can't believe that they think they can just keep saying, oh, we're just diagnosing it more, and people won't notice. I've got an autistic child on my street. I've got people at work who have children with autism. I never saw autism when I was a child, never. And people, children who can't talk, children who are so sick they are nonverbal. I mean, you would notice that back then, wouldn't you?
That's a good point. So when was glyphosate introduced to our diet, and when did it become such a threat to our health?
Good question. It was first introduced on the market around mid-1970s, around 1975, and initially it was only used, small amounts. It really kicked off around 1998 when they started really getting the GMO Roundup Ready crops going. Once they did that, it started skyrocketing, and it has been going up dramatically. I think it's several hundredfold over what was there just 20 years ago, and it keeps on going up every year. And the government is spending very little money even testing whether it's in the food. So we have very little specific knowledge of whether it's in the food, but people like moms across America have taken the initiative to get people tested, and they found glyphosate in the breast milk.
Oh my gosh, that's shocking.
It's very shocking. And it's probably worse if your child's taking a soy formula, you're going to for sure have glyphosate, because that's the GMO Roundup Ready soy. It's not labeled, so you can't even know whether it is or not.
I'm afraid there are people who actually don't want this information to get out there, right?
Oh, absolutely there are. I mean, because they're making such a good profit out of this and of course, it's a major factor, I think, in the transition to an industrialized nation. You see countries like China, which were called they had an agricultural economy, and now they've transitioned into this so-called industrial economy. All of a sudden, they don't need farmers anymore. They just buy GMO Roundup Ready soy from the West. So then their farmers are all disenfranchised, and the farmers are in bad shape, but meanwhile, they were able to work towards technology and, bring themselves up to the first world and all this great stuff. The fact is, we have very few of our population who are farmers today, because farming has become so easy. All you have to do is just spray the poison all over the crops, and you're done. Basically, it's not that simple, but it's just that you can have these massive farms with very few people actually involved in farming and produce huge amounts of food. So that seems like a really good deal. All you have to do is just poison the entire population. That's the price you pay. They think that price is fine.
We want to take just a moment now and thank our sponsors. Parents, are you concerned about vaccine side effects? Free and Healthy Children International offers a simple, safe, and effective way to reduce infectious disease in your family: homeoprophylaxis. Free and Healthy Children International supports research and access to homeoprophylaxis, the vaccine alternative. Visit freeandhealthychildren.org to find a practitioner in your area. And The Adventures of Andrew Price. Sandrine Love of Nourishing Our Children has co-created a charming limited edition children's book. It has been described as beautifully illustrated and written. The fictitious great-great-nephew of Dr. Weston A. Price follows in his footsteps and discovers how traditional societies nourish themselves for optimal health. Visit adventuresofandrewprice.com. And now, back to the program. And just to be clear, I think you said this earlier, but I want to review. The poison or the pesticides aren't simply on top of the crops, they're inside the crops.
They're inside the crop. The crop soaks it up. And of course it disrupts the crop as well. So the sulfur deficiency comes right from the food because the food can't get the sulfur because of the glyphosate. So you're eating sulfur deficient food on top of the fact that the poison is also affecting your ability to manage the sulfur in your body appropriately, which is why you get all this sulfate deficiency.
Going back to the cholesterol thing. So if I go to the doctor and my doctor says you have high cholesterol, should I be afraid? Should I go on a low-fat diet?
Of course, I don't think so. And in fact, the high cholesterol is also very, very interesting in terms of the glyphosate, because the Roundup, in fact, it's additional components of the Roundup. In addition to the glyphosate, there's these adjuvants that they add to it to make it much more toxic to the plants, which of course also makes it much more toxic to us. And interestingly, they don't have to test that. When they test to get past the regulatory process, they test the active ingredient in isolation, and then they use it in conjunction with things that can make it 1,000 times more toxic to the plant, to the weed, and also to us. And that's fine. They don't have to test that. It's really pretty remarkable. That was a big digression there. But we get back to the glyphosate, the Roundup. Roundup disrupts a protein called STAR. It has a complicated name that I won't give you. But that protein allows the cholesterol to get into the mitochondria where it's needed to make the bile acids. So when that protein is blocked, the liver has a hard time making bile acids. And usually the liver would ship a lot of cholesterol out through the bile acids, and eventually that would make its way to the body, and it would distribute the cholesterol in a different way.
In a helpful way.
In a helpful way, in a good way. And along with the sulfate, by the way, because that cholesterol that gets converted with the STAR is able to be sulfated, and then it ships out the sulfate in the bile acids as well, which helps to distribute the sulfate over the whole system. Cholesterol as cholesterol sulfate. So when you can't do that because of the glyphosate, and there's other poisons that cause that too, then the liver is stuck either with building up fatty liver, and fatty liver is a total epidemic right now, fatty liver disease.
That used to only affect more alcoholics, is
yes,
that right?
It's supposed to be an alcoholic thing, but not anymore. In fact, they now say fructose causes fatty liver, and I can explain why in a moment. But basically, you get the fatty liver, or you ship out LDL, the bad guy, the so-called bad guy cholesterol. The liver has to get rid of it, has to distribute the cholesterol some way, has to distribute it to the body because cholesterol is essential to the body. So since it can't produce the bile acids, it just ships it out as LDL particles, packaged inside these lipid particles, because without the sulfate, the cholesterol is not water soluble. You have the high LDL because you have the sulfate deficiency.
It's like cholesterol has a nice little partnership with the sulfate.
That's
and they're
right.
like friends. And
That's
when
right.
they get separated, this is my simple little illustration, but when they get separated, then something bad's going to happen
Yes.
to the liver, the place where it's all processed, or to the lonely little cholesterol traveling without its friend.
Yes,
right?
and in fact, the sulfate traveling without its friend, too. That's the most amazing thing. They are soulmates. And when they are separated, both of them are highly distressed because the sulfate also can't be just shipped. It gets a partnership with cholesterol that allows it to be shipped without doing damage. They both are extremely important molecules for many different important biological processes.
And glyphosate's dividing them up.
Exactly
and
so.
it's not working in the way it's supposed to work,
That's
right?
exactly right. So getting back to the fructose, and in fact, I think there's been a lot of publicity. I think Lustig, there have been people who have talked about fructose being really bad for you and causing fatty liver disease.
Wait, fructose is just the sugar in fruit, right?
That's right. And fruit you would think would be a healthy food, and in fact, it should be a healthy food. The problem with fructose is glyphosate. So glyphosate actually messes up the body's, the microbes, the gut microbes' ability to process fructose correctly. Fructose is usually converted into something called phosphoenolpyruvate, PEP, And that molecule is the input to the shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. That's a biological pathway that produces some essential amino acids, the aromatic amino acids. The microbes use the fructose to make the aromatic amino acids normally, but the glyphosate blocks that. So what happens is the PEP piles up because it can't go through that pathway. And when the PEP piles up, it disrupts the way fructose is managed. And what happens is the fructose gets converted into very nasty glycating agents, things like methylglyoxal and glyoxylate. These things are much, much worse than glucose in terms of causing glycation damage, which is basically the damage you get from high sugar.
Right.
In
So
your blood.
everyone points the finger at refined sugar. So bad for you, so bad
Yes.
for you. But have an apple instead of that sweet pie, right?
Yes.
But you're saying that the body can't use what the apple has to offer, and it actually causes other problems if you've got glyphosate coming in at the same time.
That's right.
Is that why you go with strictly organic?
Yes,
Because
yes,
if
absolutely.
there's glyphosate on my apple or some other fruit, it's going to get into me. Even the ones
Or even
that,
if you're eating the apple with something that has glyphosate in it. But fructose, of course, the fructose that's really bad is high fructose corn syrup. And that's the cheap sugar that they use in a lot of the processed foods. Like in Coca-Cola, for example, in America, you have high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup, of course, comes from corn, comes from GMO Roundup Ready corn, so it's got glyphosate in it. And I think that's what's making Coke so toxic. And people are realizing that Coke is toxic. The Coke industry is really hurting right now. People are getting that message, Coke is bad. I think that, again, glyphosate is a major reason why Coke is bad for you.
Interesting. I don't think people had put two and two together with that. They just thought it's all the sugar in the soda or the high fructose corn syrup, but not realizing again that glyphosate was behind the scenes there.
Right, and when you look at sugar, we've got a lot of talk now about, sugar's bad for you.
Yeah.
And we're getting that message out, which is probably good, although sugar is not really that bad for you. Sugar is a really easy energy, usually, in a normal system that's working. Sugar's a great fuel. The mitochondria totally know how to turn sugar into energy. That's what we're best at, really. So it's very weird that sugar's bad for you. And, in the old days, they used to make all these wonderful desserts with the fruit pies and everything. They were delicious back in the early 1900s, before glyphosate.
Uh-huh.
But now, if you look at the sugars, you've got high fructose corn syrup from GMO Roundup Ready corn. You've got beet sugar, GMO Roundup Ready beets. And you've got cane sugar, which is not Roundup Ready, but sugar cane is one of those crops that's sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest. So all the sugars are going to be contaminated with glyphosate.
Wow, it sounds like, is there any way to get away from this glyphosate? It sounds like a big
It's
nightmare.
really scary. It's very scary, and you can't avoid it. It's in the water, too. A study in Kentucky showed that it was in something like over 80% of the rainwater that they tested had glyphosate in it. I mean, it's just all over the place. If you live near an agricultural field, then you're in even worse shape. So you can't avoid it, but I think you can do a lot. First of all, don't buy it and use it on your lawn, obviously. Tell your neighbors not to use it if you can convince them, and buy organic. I think buying organic is really, really huge. And my feeling is that if we can get enough people to hear this message and to spread this word to their friends, buy organic, we can do this through the market. If we just say we will not buy your poison food, it'll be a market-driven response by the farmers, and I think eventually, it'll take time, organic prices will drop because there's so much more demand. People will figure out how to do organic more cheaply. And that's what we need to do. We need to throw away all those poisons that are being used, not just the glyphosate. We can't just replace it with 2,4-D. Right now, because of the resistant weeds, they're developing GMO crops engineered to be resistant to other toxic chemicals that are supposed to be much worse than Roundup. 2,4-D, dicamba. 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange.
They're just going to cause more damage, right?
Yeah, so they're going to have. So they already have products now that have been approved. The EPA says no problem. I don't know. They are sleeping on the job. That's fine. They're looking at 2% of the kids with autism. That's fine too. I mean, what is the matter with our country that we can't wake up and see what's happening to us? I don't understand that.
Wow. But you're saying that some choices we make will send a message. And they'll also make us healthier, right?
Exactly so. So you convert your family to organic, you will see improvements in their health, and you will save money in the long run on those medical bills that you don't have for that cancer down the road or that heart disease or that autism. I mean, those things are really expensive, let alone, of course, the disturbance of having to deal with a member of your family that's so sick. You are saving money, and you are making your life much, much better by eating organic.
And you don't work for an organic farmer. You're
I
not
don't.
trying to
I have
make
no
money
stake
from
in this. I mean, I spend lots of money on organic food,
Because you're right. It is it's a savings in the end because you're saving money on healthcare costs.
Exactly.
I understand in the U.S. people spend less on food and more on healthcare, and in other countries people spend more on food and less on healthcare.
Right. We have by far the cheapest food. When you look at the per capita income and what percentage is spent on food, we are like the cheapest in the world, I think, pretty much. And when you look at the percentage spent on healthcare, we're absolutely by far the most expensive in the world in terms of our healthcare. And that's because we're sick. We are really sick in this country, and we are just in an amazing state of denial. I don't understand how people can just see all the problems kids are having today and not think that this is not normal. You know, the asthma, the eczema, all the food allergies, food intolerances, lots of picky eaters, all kinds of gut problems, and then, of course, ADHD, autism. I mean, it's amazing what we're putting up with. The poor parents. I feel really bad for parents today that their kids are facing so many health issues that I think could be greatly improved by just eating organic.
Wow, well, I thought we were just going to talk about
we got off topic, and I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. Cholesterol, sulfate, and all this, and heart disease. But I'm glad you've given us some practical tips for living healthier lives and avoiding heart disease, but avoiding other things as well. So thank you so much for coming out today, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. Become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation for $40 or $25 if you're a student or a senior. Your contribution helps us to get this important health information to people all around the world. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Become a Member. Again, thanks for listening. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food farming and the healing arts.